Hello, welcome to Ararat Gallery Tama. Ararat Gallery Tama is located on the lands of the Eastern Maar people, and our presenters visit us from the lands of the Bunurong people and the Wurundjeri people. We acknowledge them as traditional custodians of the land and pay respect to their elders, past and present. I'm thrilled to welcome Nanette Carter and Robyn Oswald-Jacobs to share the story of their deep dive into the life of Australia's most influential and celebrated textile designer of the 20th century, Frances Burke. We are fortunate to hold 40 examples of Burke's designs in the Tama collection, many of which were generously donated by the pioneering designer in 1986. 24 of these works can be seen in our exhibition, Frances Burke, Works from the Tama Collection, between the 25th of September 2021 and the 6th of February 2022. Over to Nanette and Robyn.
Thank you, Katie. So our presentation on Frances Burke, as the audience would know, comes from our book, The Deep Dive, in fact called Frances Burke, Designer of Modern Textiles. And so I'm going to open today with the question, so who was textile designer Frances Burke and why was she significant? Frances Burke was a dynamo. She was a tastemaker, she was feisty, commanding, and she had a very clear way of expressing herself. Philip Goad, Professor Philip Goad, in the foreword to our book, describes her in the following way. Although short-statured, Burke stands tall in the 20th century Australian design. She was a major force, a brilliant designer, a technical innovator for her craft, a champion for progressive textile design, and a supremely successful retailer and business owner. She was a pace setter who made textiles her life from the inception of her business in 1937 to 1970 when she closed the doors. So briefly to her background and training, Burke was born in Spotswood in Melbourne and grew up in the northern suburbs of Coburg in a family who had some understanding of textiles, both parents having textile-related jobs. Her mother a tailoress and her father employed by a Flinders Lane textile and clothing manufacturer, which enabled him to bring home pieces of fabric for the family's enjoyment and their consideration and some education. In 1932, Burke's mother died, leaving each of her 3 children an inheritance which was the equivalent of a year's wage. With the freedom that her inheritance created, Burke was fortunately able to give up her previous commitment to nursing, and within a year had enrolled at the Gallery School and at the Melbourne Technical College, now known as RMIT, and later at the George Bell School. So in 1933, Burke enrolled at the Gallery School, and in doing so, took on the early years of a classic academic training, repetitively drawing from plaster casts under the tuition of teachers who resisted modern art and frowned on experimentation. It was only after some years of this discipline that the students were allowed to paint. However, Burke was satisfied, and she felt she was technically well equipped to draw. Though on reflection, we may think that this part of her training was in fact diametrically opposite to her later explosion onto the design scene. At that stage, the Gallery School was housed in the building we now know as the State Library Victoria, the building then being shared between the State Library, the National Gallery of Victoria, and the Museum of Victoria. So right opposite the Melbourne Technical College. So she slipped across the road and began some part-time study at Melbourne Tech, as it was called. She was taught here to print with lino blocks and silk screens by Napier Waller, who had pioneered lino printing in Australia, and possibly also by printer Michael O'Connell, about whom Nanette will talk. In developing her fledgling design and print practice, she created work that was considered exemplary, and these 2 practitioners particularly, and was therefore awarded the Art Scholarship, which she held for the next 3 years. But clearly she felt she needed to expand her creative horizons and in 1936, she joined the George Bell School, where she was given the freedom to be herself, to be creative, and to explore Bell's triumvirate: form, colour and line. Interestingly, her great friend May Casey later wrote that Bell made his students brave, resisting and releasing them from their timorous inhibitions. The time Burke spent with Bell set her on her life course. Her use of form and her line were often deceptively simple, but she was developing her passion for colour, which she described as a living, joyous thing. It vibrates, she said, and her designs became vibrantly alive. She was to distill the knowledge and experience acquired from the three educational institutions, the Gallery School, the MTC and the George Bell School, and make a considered decision to follow a career in design rather than as an artist, and to produce her wonderfully distinctive fabrics for the next 30 years. So over to Nanette.
Frances Burke was not the first Melbourne artist to explore textile designing and printing. From 1930, British artist Michael O'Connell produced highly original fabric designs printed on heavy Irish linen, which he sold through fashionable boutiques, the Arts and Crafts Society of Victoria exhibitions, and from his studio in Beaumaris. Melbourne society ladies like Elizabeth Murdoch, wife of publisher Sir Keith, and Burke's friend May, wife of politician Richard Casey, decorated their homes with O'Connell's linens for wall hangings and curtains, together with Fred Ward's native timber furniture. A Murdoch family home, Cruden Farm at Langwarrin, still has a fountain made by O'Connell in its walled garden. Together with his wife, Eleanor, O'Connell left Melbourne for London in early 1937, ostensibly to attend George VI's coronation celebrations, but fortunately for Frances Burke, they decided not to return, creating a gap in the market and so a remarkable opportunity. A few months after the O'Connells' departure, Pierre Fornari, the fashion director of George's Collins Street department store, suggested in a newspaper interview that Australian fashions should use the colours and motifs seen in Aboriginal people's cultural production. He argued that bull roarers, armlets, basketry, and body painting in natural pigments created for ceremonies should provide Australian designers with inspiration. Burke had been sketching in the ethnographic section of Melbourne Museum, so she made an appointment to show Fornari her work, which resulted in a commission to design and print 60 yards of fabric. According to Burke, the exercise was a technical disaster, and so she and Melbourne Tech's fellow student Maurice Holloway purchased another 60 yards and consulted an industrial chemist to ensure their production was wash fast and light fast, unlike O'Connell's, which were notoriously unstable. In a 1980 lecture, Burke explained that Fornari had used her designs for a few glamour garments placed in the store's arcade of front windows. Meanwhile, a Miss Lawson, who worked in the women's fashion department, asked Frances Burke directly to supply the store with additional designs to make up into garments. This was when orders really picked up for Burway Prints, the name of the new business made from the names Burke and Holloway. Burke produced a range of designs inspired by sea creatures, starfish, seahorses, and shellfish. Interestingly, this was not the Indigenous influenced designs that Fornari had championed, although within a couple of years, a dress made using a Burke design inspired by the tapa cloths of Melville Island appeared in George's Fashion Gazette. After George's, the Myer Emporium, with its larger client base and multiple stores, commissioned a range of fabrics influenced by Pacific Island cultures like bird and tree. The Pacific was all the rage in the United States, with the 1935 Clark Gable film Mutiny on the Bounty creating a fascination about the region. In the late 1930s, the British Orient Line began promoting Pacific Island cruises on a series of stylish new vessels aimed at the section of the middle-class market who had done well during the Depression. New Zealand architect Brian O'Rourke had designed the Orient Line fit-outs and commissioned a range of British and Commonwealth designers and artists for painting murals, furnishings and advertising posters, so that ships were seen as floating ambassadors for modern design. Architecture students rushed on board when they docked in Sydney and Melbourne to view their interiors. Burke's Pacific Island designs for Maya were used for resort wear that young women might wear on such cruises, as well as on Australian beaches. Other designs based on exotic locations, such as jungle, were used for resort wear, for beach bags, and even tablecloths. Despite the outbreak of World War II in 1939, Burway prospered, employing between 5 and 6 staff members. Restrictions on shipping meant printed fabrics became scarce. And while rationing strictly limited the purchase of new garments and lengths of clothing fabric, Burke found a way to work within the regulations. She'd begun producing furnishings as well as fashion fabrics in 1938. And while they were rationed, since people didn't need to change their furnishings as often, women could use the household ration of furnishing fabric for other purposes. From the studio, Burke sold hemmed lengths of Irish linen, then Japanese cotton until Japan entered the war in 1942, and finally Indian cottons that Australian women sewed into stylish garments. Burke also produced table mats, tablecloths and napkins with Australian designs based on native flora like the flannel flower that American servicemen and women purchased as souvenirs and gifts to mail back home. Meanwhile, Maurice Holloway withdrew from the business in 1942 when he was called up for war service.
So, over to me. In 1938, shortly before the war, and after establishing the Burway business, Burke and Holloway had set up a studio and print works in a building housing legal chambers in Little Collins Street, with its commensurate access problems. But 10 years later, in the post-war period, she had moved both the office and the print works to the more accessible Hardware Street in the city, a little later adding her retail outlet, New Design, to the mix. In addition to her own fabric, she carried stock by local Melbourne designers, the furniture by Grant Featherston and Clement Meadmore, and lighting by the Melbourne-based Becco. Pieces by Charles and Ray Eames and Harry Bertoya also found their way into the shop and featured in advertisements. Rounding out the offer were locally produced kitchen tables and chairs in the contemporary mix that was aluminium and formica. And there was also carefully selected imported kitchenware, pieces that she felt were both safe and well enough designed to appeal to the increasingly discerning modern housewife. She was also now closer to the mid-city action, to Maya, Hicks Atkinson and George's, whom she was supplying, and the smaller shops and galleries that were springing up in the city after the war. At the same time as offering eye-catching designs to the retail market, Burke had been developing business relationships with architects, so commissions increasingly formed a strong part of her business. Architects trusted her to supply appropriate fabrics, printed with appropriate designs on time for their projects. And the mix of designs for commissions and motives which excited her accounted for the apparently broad range of sources which she used for inspiration. So the beach, the sea, seaweed shells, leaves and flowers from both native and European sources, Indigenous objects, nautical, aeronautical and abstracted motifs all found their way into her designs. One of the main commissions she had, which in this period really got her off the blocks, was a commission from architect Guildford Bell, who had been selected by Reg Ansett, the owner of Ansett Airlines and of the very new Hayman Island, to design and deliver furnishings for the beachside bedroom cabins and the entertaining areas of the ultra-smart new resort. We believe the fabrics that Burke designed for this resort were some of the best designs she produced, and among them were Sea Piece and Angelfish, for which neither Ansett nor Bell sought copyright, so she was able to establish or to further establish her business in Melbourne on the back of them. Although it was widely believed that she must have had a great time visiting the tropical island, she in fact extracted inspiration from a pile of sponges and shells which Bell had sent down to Melbourne in a sack. Over to Nanette.
Although unable to visit Hayman Island, Burke began to travel abroad from 1947, making an annual trip until 1950, then roughly every second year, always flying since she was not at all interested in long journeys by sea. After these trips, she was always interviewed on her return by Australian newspapers and magazines and gave lectures to various social groups on design, architecture and style. Burke would report back on her findings on the latest developments in the furniture and retail industries to the Society of Designers for Industry, the first professional group for designers in Australia, of which she was the sole woman founding member. The United States and Canada was the destination of her first trip, and the US was the country she visited most often, although after a 5-month trip in 1953 to the US, UK and Europe, she decided that Italy was the most exciting country for design. Though well known for her fascination with Australian Indigenous and Pacific Island cultures, Burke was also enthusiastic about the artistic traditions of Asia. On her first overseas trip, Burke visited Toronto to see its museum's collection of East Asian and Indian art. Her fascination for Asian art and design can be seen in her 1948 design Plum Blossom and her 1952 design titled Cane, prior to her visiting any Asian countries. In 1955, she was impressed by her experience of a traditional Japanese house which was erected on the roof of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And in 1962, she finally visited Hong Kong, the Philippines, Japan and Taiwan, and visited them all again in 1966. Frances Burke became a household name in the 1950s with the success of her business, primarily, although not exclusively, due to her focus upon furnishing fabrics. During World War II, Australian women had entered the workforce in larger numbers. Both men's and women's wages increased during the war and consumer goods were in short supply. Men serving in the armed forces were often able to save the majority of their pays for when they got home. As a result, there were record high household savings throughout the nation. With the end of the war, couples who had delayed marriage tied the knot and once married began having children. Along with the high household savings, government measures like cheaper loans and the release of new greenfield sites for housing drove the post-war housing boom. Businesses like Burke's, engaged in supplying household goods, enjoyed increasing orders in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s. Every new house needed furniture and furnishings, preferably new ones that were modern in style, to suit the small but increasingly open plan, light-filled and boldly coloured homes of the period. While the Australian economy was volatile throughout the 1950s and 60s, by expanding her staff and collaborating with retailers and decorators when sales were up, and at other times closing her studio and contracting out the printing, Burke remained in business. She continued leveraging her public profile after trips abroad by writing articles about design for magazines and journals and advertising in popular publications. While she no longer enjoyed the monopoly she had experienced during World War II, Burke's business prospered throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, despite the growth of competition from international and other local suppliers. Over to you, Robyn.
Remarkably, in the 1960s, designs which Burke had first marketed at the start of her business 30 years earlier were still selling and were still considered fresh, notably Tiger Stripe and Crete. She also extended the life and reach of her earlier designs by increasing the number of colours or by introducing textural effects. At this stage, her current designs were becoming increasingly abstract. Mosaic was one of them, and Luna is also a great example of a later textual design. Pacifica, Lynx and Staccato all appeared to pick up the feeling from contemporary furniture. Pacific was used in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Adelaide, and Staccato in one colour is the design used for the poster advertising this excellent exhibition at Tama, which Tama has mounted from their collection. During 30 years of her business, Burke's fabrics had retailed Australia-wide. Architects had commissioned them for residential, public and community buildings, including hospitals, theatres, company towns and ski lodges. And although she'd made various marketing and location changes to her business, she made the decision to close in 1970. And for the last 20 years of her life, focused on advocacy for her two earlier loves, the Craft Council, which had been formed from the Arts and Crafts Society of Victoria, and the Design Institute of Australia, which had been formed from the Society of Designers for Industry. She also lent her vocal support to the newly established National Print Council. For you who are interested in following up on more of Burke's designs, our book features pieces from all the following collections. The National Gallery of Australia, which has the largest collection, 184 pieces, as John McPhee was the first of the decorative arts curators to recognise her significance. Later, the Powerhouse, followed by the National Gallery of Victoria, and smaller collections were acquired by Sydney Living Museums and the RMIT Design Archives, in addition to the Tama collection. Burke died in 1994, ending a working life of 50 years, a partnership of 67 years with her loving companion Phoebe Chamberlain, and a commitment to design of 70 years. A remarkable life. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanette and Robyn. It's fascinating to learn about the truly remarkable human behind these distinctive patterns, particularly the unexpected stories behind the inspiration, like the sack of shells and sponges. Thank you so much for your time today.